you're watching Muscle Minds with Dr. Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally, and our programming is brought to you by byobbcoach.com. You can get Scott's book at that address, or you can go to Amazon, or you can go to Scott's link and get even a better discount on the hardcover, which it's a great book. We recently asked, like, hey, what's a great bodybuilding book for me to learn more? And we always suggest in the group, be your own bodybuilding coach, because it literally covers every aspect from your off-season setting goals, running through those goals, all the way into your contest prep, into the peak and water manipulation, and all the way back out the other side, full circle. We're also brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there for some additional savings. SupplementSource.ca for Canadians. Great deals that change week to week. And of course, we're brought to you by Patreon. Thank you guys for everything that you do over at Patreon. So what was this question, Scott? I want to pull this back up here. We had something along the lines of, let me just throw it up on the screen too. He's got a question about DC. I think when I run it, I did it wrong because I got so beat up since I never did a cruise. But with more recent information and studies about frequency and whatnot, do you think DC, meaning DC training or dog crap training, is still a good split to run?
So this comes from Miłosz Gorowski.
Okay.
I think I pronounced his first name at least.
You did better than I would have, that's Miłosz, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like a W, but it's spelled it's an L with a cross to it. I don't even know what you call that letter. We don't.
Okay.
So let's see. I made some notes on this. It's the interesting thing about this question, or one interesting aspect of it, just in general, is this idea that DC, which has been around for roughly 1999, and there's massive success. There are innumerable instances of people who've done really well with DC training, that body of practical in the trenches evidence would somehow be negated. And I'm not trying to pick on Miłosz here, but it would be negated by whatever the science has to say.
Okay.
Somehow, like the fact that it worked, right?
Yeah.
That you have a car that can go, 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, and then there's new technologies that comes out, and you would say, well, is that car still fast? Like, yeah, it's still fast. It doesn't matter.
2.5 is still 2.5. Yeah,
it's still fast. So DC training is still amazing. The other thing that it seems like this is important for this question, because this happens a lot. So he's not the first person to ever do this. Many people do. Is he knows he didn't do DC training correctly because he didn't cruise.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you got to, and he beat himself up. Maybe I'm reading into this, but I'm doing this kind of for the purpose of the podcast. Is that he neglected his internal sense of when he should stop.
Yeah.
And then beat himself up. And then instead of saying, well, look, maybe I should have paid attention and tried cruising, earlier, learn from that and learn from my personal experience. Instead, I'm going to look to what the literature an external source might tell me what to do. Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a very simple thing we do. And people will ignore their gut feeling, their instinctive feeling, their intuition, and turn to an external source, a politician or some other social leader or someone else in a power position or authority position, and they will say, well, they'll tell me what to do, right? So, like, use the car example. It's like I got this, this Mustang that I can do 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds in, but electric car is the new fastest thing, so I need to get an electric car. They're like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
Unless you run out, like there's no gasoline around or whatever, but you don't need to do that. Listen to because something is old and it was produced before new evidence has come out, which could help us refine things, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not good anymore. So I've even, like, this is a bit of a side, I'll get back on topic, but I've heard people have come to me who were students in exercise science classes where the rule was they weren't allowed to use any research that was published more than 5 years ago, which I think is absolutely asinine.
Huh.
It could be that new research has come out and built upon that in that body of literature. That
True.
makes sense. There's the possibility. This is why this rule would come from, is that you're missing out on what the cutting edge state of the literature is by using older studies. But some older studies just can't be done anymore, and that doesn't necessarily mean that evidence is no longer valid.
True, that makes sense.
You have to look at those studies, of them by themselves. So then let's look at how DC training stands up. And this is the important part, right? So given the body of literature, I'm not going to go through, everything this is in the Fortitude Training book a little bit. I talk about it a bit in the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book, and there's a new version of Fortitude Training that will come out eventually. But we've got new science. There's just so much exercise science in the resistance training area that is being published now that wasn't around when Dante was formulating DC training initially. But frequency. So, first of all, let's go to the root. The main thing that DC training focuses on is on progressive overload. It's slag iron, baby. That is a principle that basically is used. We talked about this here too before, Scott, is that basically every resistance training study in their methodology, sometimes they will fail to mention, but almost all, and those who don't, I think you presume this, so the editors maybe have missed, noting that you should mention this. They're using progressive overload. They don't just bring people in and start them off with whatever weight they can lift with between a 10 and 12 rep repetition scheme and just keep the weight the same for the full 12 weeks, unless that's a condition they're testing where there's no progressive overload. All of them do progressive overload, and that is exactly what DC is. Progressive overload is quote unquote the most accepted scientific aspect of a resistance training program that there is. It's basically incorporated into all of them, right? So it's always there, and that's what DC training is about. As far as frequency goes, you can look at the meta-analyses, you can look at those sorts of things. DC training, if you're doing the two-way split, there's different splits, but the two-way split is the basic meat and potatoes, where you would train basically upper, lower 3 times a week. So it's basically you're training every muscle group. Dante would always know it's 3 times in 10 days. That works out to about 9 times a month, or chest over 2 times a week. So it's basically within like the 2 to 3 times a week, which is what the literature suggests. So it's good as far as frequency goes, right? Yeah. There's no problems there. Dante also has a 3-way split, which is a little less frequent. So just in those 2 versions, he's covered the range of frequencies that can work for people. And he also has a more advanced split that for people who are over 35 or guys that are more like him, and it's like a 5-way split, and you can find that on Tense Muscle. It's a different split. And that is something that you could do if you're really advanced and you find that works for you. Dante recognizes this, that different frequencies work differentially for different people. We covered that here with the Barcelo study, where they trained 2 or 3 or 5 times a week. Some people grew better with more or less volume, less or greater frequency. So Dante has that built in. And if you look at the best bodybuilders in the world, they generally are training like maybe once every 5 days or once a week on the bro split. Yeah. And that's also built into DC training. People talk about high and low rep sets being ways to grow muscle mass. Dante has Widowmakers that are built in, right? Those are high rep sets. If you're doing the 3-way, especially, there's room for, when I was the official DC trainer, my sort of rule of thumb, I may have gotten this from Dante, I'm not positive, probably did, because I would always confer with him about things because it's his system, right? But you could do like up to 5 Widowmakers per week for different muscle groups. Okay. So you do a push-pull legs, right? And you might do a Widowmaker for quads, and then for calves, and then for back and chest and shoulders, and that's it. You're not going to do biceps and try. You're not going to do every exercise, right?
Yeah, I even feel like 5 I'd be wrecked.
That's the max. That's like the max for pretty much anyone. That's someone who's eating maximally. They're pushing everything. Maybe they're in a situation they're coming off a layoff, so everything's kind of novel and they're growing really, really well. Yeah. So, and the other thing, which isn't. Which Dante, I think, nailed. It's why I adopted a very similar way of doing this in Fortitude training, is periodization. So there's a study that came out just last year, and they did like 9 weeks of training. They compared 9 weeks of training straight through with just plopping 1 week of deload in there, like no training, to see if that somehow allowed for like a functional overreaching effect. So the guys would come back a little bit stronger after that week and then progress, at a higher rate or even more rapidly, having had the week off, or the deload week. And it didn't help. Actually, it sort of seemed like it slowed the strength gains. But the thing that was missed here is he didn't do a deload. And Dante is all about auto-regulating the deload. So the deload matches how you feel. It matches your performance.
Yeah.
Right? And that's something that I think actually he's still kind of ahead of. There's, or of course, Eastern Bloc literature, and that goes way into the periodization that happens with high-level strength and power athletes, right? And they're using all sorts of periodization schemes. Bodybuilders are not going to do that, and there's probably, when you add in the fact that a lot of the lifters, not all, but many of them are also enhanced, so that's changing things along the way, and you try to add together levels of periodization with different levels of drug intakes and everything else, you get just like this spaghetti of things to juggle that just doesn't work. But Dante had periodization built in there too, which has been scientifically substantiated. In bizarre studies like that, where they just plop a week in the middle of a training period, no wonder that didn't work. For some people, all they did was they took a week off of training unnecessarily. They didn't need a deload week. In DC training, you take the deload week when you feel like you need it. And then you also do the deload week in a way that suits you. I took what Dante had suggested and I standardized, because I think a lot of people weren't very good. This is probably a failure of me as a coach in helping them figure out, when doing DC training, how to do their deload. Because some people would just be they'd push so hard.
Yeah.
Right. And then they just take 2 weeks off, and because it's just like they needed it, and they'd have a non-functional overreaching. They would get back. They would actually be behind where they were. They lose strength and have to spend the next, half of their blast getting back to where they once were. That doesn't work. That doesn't help to do it that way. So, so this notion of auto-regulation is super important. And I think, to be honest, I think that's where science has a limitation in terms of external validity, because studies want to answer very specific questions about the effect on average when you have a sample from a given population of a specific program. So everyone follows that program, regardless of whether it works well for the first 6 weeks and then it just drives you to the ground for the next 6 weeks, or if it's working great for you. Everyone just does that. So you're going to have some level of success that's greater for some people and lesser for some people. And you'll see in many, many programs, you'll see these non-responders, people who don't have any muscle growth after 8 or 10 or 12 weeks of training, when they show the individual data. Now, I would love to see, this is kind of my thing I wish we would see more of, is training data, like in a supplementary file. Let's see what happened in terms of those people's training load. So
you mean did they progress kind of thing? Or?
Yeah, let's say it's 10 weeks of training. Does that person who doesn't progress, does his training weights go up for the first 5 weeks and then stagnate, and then you see he's struggling even to get the reps that he was getting previously? It's okay, that's a clear, anyone who's training someone in the gym, or someone who is training themselves, to be it's time for a deload. It's time to step back. So the way in order to answer the question of those studies, does this program, compared to some other program with a twist on it, that's the difference in the conditions, does it do X, Y, and Z? That question is a different question on average for a sample. It's a different question than if you're talking about an individual person, because an individual person might need to take a break, whereas someone else might be thriving on that program and just kicking ass. Yeah. And they can maybe even handle more volume. So that's where that auto-regulation, that intuition, that training smart gets lost in training studies, unless that's something that should be built in. And that's it could easily be, you could systematize a system of progressive overload So like with DC training, this is how he does this very smartly. So you have an A, B, and C rotation of exercise that you use with DC training.
Okay.
So, standing squat, pendulum squat, leg press, right? For your quads, quote unquote. And you progress on those, you rotate through them, workout by workout, and then when you start to stagnate on one of those, and you just pull the exercise out, or you change your foot position, right? Or you add bands, you add change, you come in for something different, and then you add novelty, and you start progressing from there.
Yeah.
Right. If you had, if you systematize something like that in a program, so that when exercise is like you'd have a compound and an isolation movement. Let's say you make it simple.
Okay.
All your subjects, when they trained, did 3 sets of the compound, 3 sets of the isolation, and they had 3 different exercises. And they would just keep it simple, these first 2 exercises, the A exercises, until which time they failed to progress based on these criteria. At which point in time, exercise A would be rotated out and B would be substituted.
Yep. Okay.
Right, and then continue forward. At which time, and you might then see, you could do a post hoc analysis and see, like, maybe some people, despite the rotation, they never progress. But I'm almost positive they would.
Yeah.
At least it's probably some of it's going to neural adaptations. But at least it would have external validity. It would make sense, because no one would keep going in who's trying to make progress, who's especially maybe an untrained person who's expected to make progress. And keep doing the same exercise and keep getting the same reps for 6 weeks in a row, which probably happens, right? You rotate out, you do something different. And that's exactly what Dante has. So Dante, in terms of practical applicability in setting up exercise to rotate that way, which is what I have in fortitude training for the loading sets too, is a step ahead of what happens in the scientific studies. So I would say it's better. So, yeah, DC training stands up to the scientific rigor as far as I'm concerned, really, really well. The thing that is the stumbling stone, perhaps, is that you got to train really, really hard, and you're taking all your sets to failure. Yeah. And the logbook is your bitch, every time you go in there, and that's a lot more pressure than some people want to put on themselves. It's not always the funnest thing, depending on your inclination and how you like to train.
Yeah, and like Dante had said too, that not everybody's ready for DC. Like, maybe not everybody can generate that level of intensity, and that's the way I had been for a long time. Like, I tried DC back in like 2006 or 7, like watching Project Super Heavyweight, and then figuring out like, okay, how am I going to do this? And I just couldn't get it, man. I just kept getting hurt. And it's because I'd gone from training, 16 sets per body part to now all of a sudden I'm going to do 1. I didn't have the skill or, for that yet.
Yeah. There's, I don't think any of it's in English, but there's a bodybuilder. Well, you know who he is, classic physique bodybuilder, Mike Sommerfeld.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Guy?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he made some, look for him in the Olympia. He made some massive progress this off season. Yeah. He has a medical condition. I want to say what it is because I'm not sure exactly, but it basically, he's talked about this openly. It limited what he could do PED wise. He like, there was one podcast where he actually showed his blood work, and like just after show, I think, or in his off season, he's hypogonadal because he's doing just one shot, and it caught him like a week after his shot, and he's hypogonadal because he's just doing HRT. Okay. Just to keep his blood work. And he was at least working with Neil Hill for a while. I think this year he's kept his blood work in check, but I think he pushed things hard, and he had a first real off season in years. Wow! And he looks amazing. He looks really, really. He brought his back up, and he did it doing an upper lower split.
Okay.
And he had just heard him go through he had sort of different phases of his training, but at one point in time he was just doing an upper lower split. He actually was training 6 days a week. Okay. So very high frequency, but just upper lower, and basically just like an all out set. He said like he was amazed by how much muscle soreness he could actually create when he just went to town. Like one set, he called it asocial, like just fucking going bonkers. Yeah. Like DC training, like intense set of the month from intense muscle, and the guy that is at the top, in classic physique. And he just pushed it up a notch. Yeah. I think he's a dark horse as far as I'm concerned.
I'll look forward to checking him out then.
Yeah, I like him too. His nickname is the Badass. Someone called him that, and he just stuck with it. So he's a solid cat. I like him a good bit. He's one of my favorite German bodybuilders in general, but German bodybuilders, of course, too. So, but anyway, so yeah, DC training stands up really well. You just gotta do it properly, do it smartly, and like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, man. Just because. Oh, one other thing that's super important: the stretches.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the thing. Now I finally can address this. Oh, God, I would have been pissed if I forgot to mention this. So everyone's talking now, like Milo Wolf is the influencer who's sort of driving this because he did his doctoral work on training the lengthened position. You hear everyone talking about there are people who are starting to train, like do all of their sets only doing partials in the lengthened position.
Wow.
To kind of exploit whatever.
We can't just take something and then just accept it. We have to go to the absolute extreme with it now, right? And then we'll say, yeah, as a group, and then everybody will be doing these short partials in the lengthened position, and then they'll say, oh, it didn't work as good as just doing a full range of motion. So apparently stretch doesn't work like we thought it did. That'll be 2 years from now. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, you want to maintain whatever you're getting adaptation wise from the full range of motion.
Yeah.
So, but the idea, they're just taking the extreme, and I think why not for a training cycle for a couple months, give it a shot and see what happens. Yeah,
why not for a period?
Yeah. So it's
it'd be novel.
Yeah, absolutely novel, and maybe get something if there's some sarcomerogenesis going on potentially in those muscles where this would typically happen. Blah blah blah. But so it's like, ooh, this is this brand new novel thing, and. It's like, well, John Meadows has had that in his system. Like he does that, like hamstrings, like, you warm up, and then, you would do after you're in a warmed up place, you would do an exercise that focuses on the stretch. That's a basic part of mountain dog training. But before that, Dante's been having people do extreme stretches.
Yeah.
Right. Which is probably the most neglected aspect of the program. It's the thing that I think most people don't do with part of fortitude training. And what you have there is tension in the stretch position. Right, and there are papers showing that just isometric contractions can produce muscle growth. And if you're doing a stretched isometric contraction, which is what an extreme stretch in DC training is, basically you have the key components: tension, lengthened position, in order to evoke whatever novel adaptation might be provoked by training the lengthened position. It's just doing partial repetitions, like whatever. Dante's had that in his system since the very beginning, right? So that is like, he's way ahead of his time as far as like what is like one of the new hot things in like what is new and novel and different that could get you a little more growth than you would have otherwise. Yeah, in the science-based, evidence-based community, so to speak. So. Yeah, so that's and people forget that. I think they're like, oh shit. Here's the thing, like that could have always, and that's why I have stretches in part of fortitude. I have the extreme stretches the way Dante does them, typically under load. Then I have occlusion stretches where you find a way to stretch the muscle so it'll hit the aspect of the muscle or in a way that fits with where you may have already evoked soreness or stimulus. So if you haven't hit upper pecs. You might do a stretch where you stretch the upper pecs and you contract in the stretch position. It creates occlusion, so I call it an occlusion stretch, or just flexibility stretches. Those are the three stretches in fortitude and flexibility stretches, just to stretch out, just to have been in that lengthened position. If you haven't done it, when you're really sore, you might choose that one. But those stretches, that aspect of DC training, could be added to any program. Yeah. So I haven't heard of anyone who's doing more of a bro split or doing their own training system that said, oh shit, I can just take Dante's extreme stretches and add that in, supplement or reduce my volume and replace, 1 or 2 sets with an extreme stretch, which can be brutal. And then secondarily, the other thing is DC calf training is training in the lengthened position. You know how the DC calves are done?
No, I don't, because I don't train calves. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, who am I talking to? You haven't thought about calf training like ever.
I skipped that part. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why your calves are
for real. For real, I did skip that part.
I know. Of course you did. There's absolutely no reason for it. It's one of the most painful things of DC training. Actually, one of the most, aside from occlusion calf training. It's the most painful calf training you can do. It is actually creates an occlusion. So I would systematize it this way. You're going to do 1 rep every 20 seconds. So it was easier to watch, gave you something to focus on. So you press up, let's say you're doing seated calf raise, whatever calf raise you're doing, you press up, come do about a 3 or 4 or 5 second negative, and then hold for 15 seconds in the stretch position.
In the stretch, okay.
And then at 20 seconds, you come back up, 3, 4, 5, hold, and you're going to do 3 reps a minute. Every 20 seconds, you're doing a rep.
Wow.
So the majority, 3/4 of the time that you're under tension is spent in the stretch position. And that's not like just an option in DC training. I mean, Dante has other ways people can do calf training, of course.
Yeah.
That's the standardized DC way to do calf training, because that's what he found, at least at one point in time, to be the most effective way. If he had to say, like, here's one way to train calves, that's it.
Yeah.
I saw Dante relatedly. I saw Dante someone asked him on Instagram, I think it was Instagram, what if you had to choose like one leg exercise, what would it be?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was roughly the question. He said squats, barbell squats, or I think Smith machine squats with a stretch, paused stretch at the bottom.
Okay, yeah.
Which I saw Samson Dowda doing, perhaps not coincidentally, like 3 or 4 days later.
No kidding.
All the way down. Yep. Pause at the bottom. Come back up. Nice upright structure.
Yeah, those are brutal.
Those are brutal, right? But that's stretch. That's contractions in the stretch position. That's DC calf training.
Okay.
And that preceded all of these studies.
Yeah.
Right. So DC was way ahead of it, and he was basing that on various things. He talked about the quail studies. The stretch overload studies with quail, which in terms of the loading time and the loading parameters doesn't match. That's an all day long stimulus.
Yeah.
But still, there's something about being in the stretch that he recognized, having a controlled eccentric, which is a stretching out, and then being in that stretch position. So he saw that coming, and that's why he had people doing calves that way, because he saw it working. And it worked, so it's in the program. So DC training it's just a gem that just is like, it's just glimmering out there amongst a field of things, and people are looking like, it's like, I want something shiny, like training in the lengthened position. It's like, oh, I got DC training right there. I could have done that the whole time. I was like, I got to focus on the logbook, progressive overload, right? DC training, it's right there. I could have done that the whole time.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, I got to train like 2 or 3 times a week. Oh, DC training, it's right there. 2-way split, 3-way split, push-pull legs, DC training, right? That's what lots of people do. High rep sets, DC training. It's all in there, right? But training beyond failure. That's what rest pause sets are about. Cluster sets, DC training. The cluster sets have been validated under various conditions with various types of cluster sets. So literally every aspect of DC training, the periodization, the whole thing, it's all scientifically backed as far as I can see. It's not going to work for everybody because there's always biological individuality, but it's scientifically, it's about as solid as you can get.
Yeah.
And it's not everybody's cup of tea, because he knows he can be a bit abrasive and brash. But Lyle McDonald is a big supporter of DC training. So this is a great program. I think he sends lots of people that direction. So
no kidding.
He's of the same that I am. Yeah. So anyway, I thought it was an awesome question.
Yeah, that's a good one. What about that other question we had, Scott? It related to insulin and fat storage. Let me see if it scroll up a little bit there. Considering the role of insulin in WAT lipolysis and also in the Randall cycle, because in the literature sometimes hyperinsulinemia overrides calories in, calories out. Does insulin make you fat? Can you please first explain this question in modern day English? I mean, I know it does insulin make you fat. That's the gist of it. But I'm not sure what the Randall cycle is. If you could explain that to us.
Oh gosh, I don't even know. Sorry, I'm getting messages here. I just got a phone call.
Oh.
What?
I said, oh. Do you need to take that call?
No. It's all good. I'm reading through the question here. The Randall cycle. I don't think we even need to go through that. There's no point without a figure going through the Randall cycle.
Okay.
And how insulin's involvement in calories, that's basically been debunked for years. Insulin has an effect on fat cell metabolism in terms of inhibiting lipolysis and promoting lipogenesis. So that's the idea that hyperinsulinemia is associated with obesity. Now, which came first, the chicken or the egg? That's kind of the big question. That's been addressed so many times. I don't even want to go into that. I think this question came from the podcast where the idea of using insulin before cardio to drive blood glucose down would help with fat oxidation, and that's really what I wanted to address.
Okay.
So I think this is where this comes from. It's a really interesting thing. So if you see someone who is obese, who has hyperinsulinemia, one aspect of that too is that they will tend to have higher blood glucose levels. So resting blood glucose level is one indicator of being insulin insensitive, right?
Yeah.
And having higher insulin levels, having lower blood glucose would mean that you would have less insulin around in most cases. So you're more insulin sensitive. So you can do a HOMA, HOMA insulin index test. People can get insulin tested and glucose tested. I mentioned this many times. There's a HOMA index, and you multiply those two factors by one another, and you can figure out how insulin sensitive you are. That's what's typically measured in the scientific studies. So the idea then being that glucose levels are reflective of insulin sensitivity and likelihood to use fat. So if you're more insulin sensitive or you've got lower insulin levels, that's going to allow fatty acids to be released and better oxidized for fuel. You see this in the morning. So when you're postprandial, you're post-absorptive, you've got no food coming in. It's been a while since you've eaten. Your blood glucose levels are at their lowest. When you exercise and do your morning cardio, you're going to use more fat, right?
Okay.
So the sort of the logical leap, which isn't really all that logical, but it may be in a logical sense, but it's not physiological. No pun there. Is that if we can lower blood glucose levels, then we're going to rely on fat more for fuel. And I think what's behind that idea is that blood glucose would be a substantial fuel source during cardio.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Okay.
In the bloodstream at 100 milligrams per deciliter, roughly, or maybe a little below that, as a normal like 80 milligrams per deciliter blood glucose levels with 5 liters of blood, you've got like 4 or 5 grams of glucose in your blood total.
Okay.
Right? So there's not much there, and the body wants to make sure that glucose is available for the brain. The brain can run on ketones, but it prefers glucose.
Sure.
Unless you're, a keto addict and you like to have ketones because it makes you feel funky and good. And I understand that too. Yeah. But during exercise, what happens typically is insulin levels go down because you've got higher blood flow to skeletal muscle, and you want to keep that insulin from binding to and being presented to the skeletal muscle, which would then cause that glucose to be taken up and would cause you to have hypoglycemia. Mm. So insulin levels go down during exercise. Sympathetic drive does that. Your sympathetic nervous system innervates your pancreas. Your insulin levels drop, and that then allows that glucose level to stay high. In fact, blood glucose with high intensity exercise, it will tend to go up somewhat because you're getting some more glycogen broken down in the liver. So your good glucose levels will come out. So that's normal, but that doesn't mean that you're using less fat. Insulin levels coming down also allow for lipolysis in the fat cells because you've got sympathetic innervation there, and you've also got adrenaline that's being released, which is going to allow lipolysis. And depending on how hard you exercise, you're going to use fat depending on the availability of fat as a fuel in the skeletal muscle. So But glucose is a minimal. It's like 5% of the fuel that's used during endurance exercise. It's very minimal. Only time when you'll see more glucose being used is if you're taking in a carbohydrate solution and you're low on glycogen.
Okay.
And that's after like 2 hours of exercise. So that's like when people are running marathons and they go on for a couple hours and they would run out of glycogen and otherwise bonk. You can prevent the bonking if before they get that low, you've got you've got glucose coming in, and now the glucose can be taken up, and it can be used in that way because you're already exercising, and the body will be able to do that, and the insulin levels will be higher because the glucose coming in. So anyway, glucose is not being used during fasted aerobic exercise hardly at all, and having glucose lower doesn't per se make a difference in terms of how much fat you use. But that's the idea behind injecting insulin before you do cardio. And it's just a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that if you do that, then you do lower glucose. The thought being then, well, there's less glucose around, so now I'll use more fat. But the lowering of the glucose doesn't change how much fat you use because glucose isn't a fuel. It's between glycogen and fatty acids coming from the blood and triglycerides in the muscle cells. So the blood glucose is immaterial. But when you inject that insulin, what does happen, potentially at least, and I only found a study in dogs where they actually did this, but what potentially happens, you do cause a drop in blood glucose. It may even become completely, or may become like technically hypoglycemic.
Sure.
Some people who do this don't feel so hot. You're going to have insulin around at higher levels than it normally would because you've injected it. So normally it goes down, and now it may be higher, or at least higher than it would have been. What you could now be doing is preventing lipolysis in fat cells.
Yeah.
So there's less fatty acids available to be oxidized, and you oxidize less fat because you've got insulin around. Insulin stops fat use as a fuel, right? Lowering insulin, which is what normally happens, permits fat use as a fuel. But the other thing that can happen, and this is what I expected, and I think this is why people kind of feel funky if they do that. Not everyone does, but sometimes people feel like just like a little kind of ragged, run down, is you can cause a counter-regulatory response. So this was a study that was done in dogs where they basically clamped, quote unquote, clamped insulin high. So the dogs were exercising on a treadmill and they elevated insulin levels, and they kept it there with an infusion. It wouldn't stay there after an injection, but it's the same idea. You got artificially elevated insulin levels.
Okay.
And then if your glucose starts to drop down, the brain will sense this, and then there will be a counter regulation. So the body's like, oh fuck, we need to get glucose levels up. The brain's like, oh fuck, and you'll have glucagon released. So when glucose is gone, glucagon gets released, cortisol, which will stress you out, and catecholamines. All three of those things were elevated to turn on glycogenolysis in the liver and bring glucose back where it was. So if you were to create a hypoglycemic challenge, like you did a lot of insulin and tried to exercise, that's what would happen when you get that sweating, all that kind of stuff. Your body's like, oh fuck, we need to get glucose back up. So that might be why people, when they do cardio, and I'm almost done here, do cardio and they inject insulin, maybe they sweat more or they feel like they did more because they have an elevated sympathetic response in terms of cortisol and catecholamines and also glucagon. Okay. So they have an elevated, a counter-regulatory response. And my only thought would be, and here's the thing, here's what I wonder, because some people find that it does seem to help with fat loss. That could be here. Only thing I can think of is that, for instance, catecholamines do turn on lipolysis too. So if there was some trickery there, like, and this is like, you're not going to get anyone to study this, right? You have to do extensive blood work on your own. But if you do put some insulin in such that you have a drop in glucose, and then you get this counter-regulatory response, and catecholamines go sky high, that could turn on lipolysis. More so afterwards, right? And one of the things like EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. One of the things that may cause that is the persistent effect of catecholamines. That's one of the potential components of that oxygen consumption. So if you inject enough insulin to cause your body to have a hyper secretion of catecholamines, then you might have excess. You might have greater lipolysis after the fact because that's like these are lots of fat burners are sympathomimetic. They mimic the sympathetic nervous system. This is a way to basically could be a way. Not that I'm suggesting people do it. This could be dangerous shit, but could be a way to prompt sympathetic nervous system activity in this counter-regulatory. Basically, put your body in an emergency situation state and get a bunch of catecholamines and glucagon everything released, which would turn on. And glucagon also inhibits your appetite.
Right.
And that could help, if you're really dieting down and you get done, you do this, and like you got excess glucagon around that you wouldn't otherwise have, your appetite will be less, you tend to eat less, it helps you stick to your diet better. So there's also just the placebo effect. Like, it's like, this shit's working. And I started my day with fasted cardio, and I pulled out of the stops, and I did the insulin. So there's no way in hell I'm going to screw it up now. Yeah. Because I just went the extra mile, and I sweated extra, and I feel like a little worse because of the insulin. Maybe people even do their cardio harder when they're in that situation because they're like, I got the gas, I'm on the goodies. So there's all those psychological effects that can help with adherence or how you go about your dieting. Just in general, plus this so that's the counter-regulatory thing. So you may have to, what is it? Take from Paul to pay Peter or whatever. Yeah.
Take from Peter to pay Paul. That's what it was.
Take from Peter to pay Paul. Yeah. I always mix it one up. But that is something that could be happening. So yeah, there's some interesting things that happen when you add, if you add insulin in or you add carbohydrate in, like just another funny, this is the opposite side of the spectrum. I remember hearing Jack Wilmore talk about some studies they were doing looking at carbohydrate during endurance exercise, like high effort endurance exercise, to see if it helped with performance. And these guys were endurance athletes. They're doing something like 20-minute all-out bout on a treadmill, like on a gradient, right, with like lots of carbohydrate coming in. Okay. And they would finish their bout, and then they had them all hooked up to an EKG and everything. And then when they got done with the bout, they just would have them get off the treadmill and go sit down. They wanted to capture their recovery heart rate and the blood glucose. And these guys would be asleep in 2 minutes.
Oh, really?
They're totally asleep. And what they noticed is that they were getting reactive hypoglycemia. Right? So they had insulin levels that elevated from the glucose, and they had all that contractile activity, which insulin sensitized the muscle. And then the insulin and the carbs, there wasn't enough carbs coming in to balance out the effects of the insulin, and their blood sugar was up during the exercise, and then it would crash. And then they would just pass out, go to sleep. Right? So, so anyway, there's all sorts of when you're taking in food during exercise, it's not something that typically would happen. The body's normally you're hunting the food, and once you got it, you're done. Yeah. Or if you're gathering berries, let's say, then you'd be eating the berries and you're just walking along. That's an easy thing. But it's not like all out effort to get to the berries, and then you eat berries and keep running all out effort. Like when we're taking carbs, and the other way around, if you're injecting insulin before you do all out exercise, you're basically creating a hormonal environment in terms of insulin exactly opposite of what typically happens in that scenario. So your body's got to flip the script somehow and keep blood glucose up, so you would get this counter-regulatory thing that may be imperceptible. People aren't freaking out and having panic attacks because they've got catecholamines that are sky high, but that potentially could be something that's affecting fat loss overall because you've created sort of a blood glucose challenge that results in a catecholamine excess, and therefore some lipolytic benefits after the bout itself too. So those are some thoughts on that. It's kind of a quizzical thing, but.
Do you know anything about catecholamines and inositol, relationship between supplementing inositol and catecholamines? And that's from Mega Jean, who's watching right now from Pittsburgh. She said she just got her first coat of tan. She's competing tomorrow in North American, so we'll wish her luck too while we're at it.
Okay. Congrats or good luck, whatever division might be. I don't know
Figure.
About inositol. Figure? Okay, cool. I don't know. Inositol is part of an important signaling molecule.
Okay.
But as far as inositol as a supplement and catecholamines, I don't know.
All right.
it would get depleted by using fat burners or something.
Could Scott go into the dangers of ephedrine with yohimbine as discussed in his book, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach?
Yeah. So we covered. Oh no, this was with Brandon DeCruz. I have a podcast with him where we went into fat burners like 6 weeks ago, so folks can see that or check that out. So they potentially can be very complementary.
Yeah.
In terms of ephedrine, basically, its action is to stimulate norepinephrine release at the sympathetic nerve terminal. So it's a sympathomimetic. Yohimbine actually does that too, but yohimbine also blocks the alpha-2 receptor. So it prevents the brake on lipolysis from being pressed in terms of activation of alpha-2s would inhibit lipolysis. So there's some complex interactions there. So there's complementary actions from using the two at the same time. The problem is, and why exactly this happens, I don't know. There's potentially two problems. One, because they do act in the same way in terms of sympathetic terminal norepinephrine release, that they can be too much.
They can what?
It could just be too much for some people. That's like using too much ephedrine. If you take like 4 pills instead of 1, right? It could just be an overload, right? Some people you just freak out. So if someone has a tendency towards anxiety or an anxiety disorder, this could push them over the edge. And there's also single nucleotide polymorphisms. There's individuals who don't metabolize yohimbine very well,
like me.
So it's
awful.
Yeah, right. So there are people who lack, and I think it's 11 hydroxylase, which is the first step in metabolizing yohimbine in most people.
Okay.
And people who lack in that will have extended blood half-life for yohimbine.
And I get that with a lot of meds, a lot of drugs.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it might be one of the P450 enzymes that CYP3A4 or something like that.
I've been planning to get that tested too. To they can see through genetic testing about how those cytokines or whatever how many you have cytochrome.
Yeah, your genes.
How they function and what you have. So it's something I want to get checked out. So hopefully I can get insurance to cover that. If
you're willing, bring it in. That'd be awesome to look at.
Okay. Yeah.
Because we can see, maybe we can theorize at least what kind of drugs you could or couldn't metabolize well based on that. And then we can see, since you've tried a few things over the years, we can see what your experiences were.
Yeah. It'd be fun.
So for some people, then they have elevated levels of yohimbine that just last really quite a long time. So they don't metabolize it very well.
Yeah.
So if you're someone then who, let's say you're going to take yohimbine 3 times a day, right?
Oof.
And it's, the levels, the half-life might be like 8 hours in the average person, something like that. And you take your standard, what is it, like 0.8 milligrams per kilogram, I think. Don't quote me on that. Like 20
something
milligrams
like
a day.
Yeah.
Would be, where someone might end up, average size human being. But typically that first dose would be being metabolized and cleared, and the second dose would lop onto it, and the third dose would lop onto it. But if the first dose is just lingering and maybe increasing, blood levels are increasing, you take the second dose, then they just piggyback on one another.
Huh.
And next thing you know, you're at your third dose and you've got, 2.5 times the levels you would have had if you had normal ability to metabolize that yohimbine.
Yeah.
And then you throw ephedrine on top of that. And the yohimbine still having those other actions, so then you have potentially freakout city. And these can affect yohimbine. The cardiovascular effects ephedrine. The cardiovascular effects tend to wane over time in the average person. That's been demonstrated. But part of what can influence your sense of anxiety is how fast your heart rate is going.
Sure.
So when you get anxious, your heart rate goes up, right?
Yeah.
Like for instance, effort level during exercise is very closely associated with heart rate. So when people do a given level of exercise without any stimulants or whatever in their system, they'll have a given level of perceived exertion.
Yeah.
But if you do things that elevate their heart rate, even with the same output in terms of work done or exercise intensity, speed on a treadmill, what have you, with an elevated heart rate, they have a higher rating of perceived exertion.
Okay.
So if you take someone then who's like, oh, I'm going to take my doses of this and I'm going to do my cardio at my lunch break, whatever, and they got a double dose of yohimbine and they're not metabolized, and then they go with the exercise. That's where I've heard of people having freakouts and having to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
When they're trying to do exercise with yohimbine in their system and ephedrine at the same time. So in the book, sorry, last thought on this. In the book, I think what I suggest to people, it's just a generic thought, is that if they're going to use multiple fat burners that they've never used that are sympathomimetic in nature, that are stimulants,
okay,
add one in, at the low dose and work their way up to that and say, okay, I think I got this one down, and then try the other one in isolation.
Yeah.
And see how you do with that one, see if you can tolerate them both. And then once you know that they're both tolerated well by you, then you can try, half doses of each. For instance, like start with baby steps. So you don't end up like, oh, I worked up to triple doses of each, and I'll just take triple
combine
doses
them
of both at the same time. No, don't do that. You got to be smart about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I've always found too that like I found that if I'm using, say, Clen with an athlete, I generally don't take the yohimbine to like that full, 20 milligrams. We usually keep it much lower. You can get a lot out of less, 8 milligrams even. You know what I mean? In combo with Clen, when you also have cardio and the right diet and, everything's already making good progress, then, 8 milligrams is plenty, say, or 7.5, something like that.
Yeah. Get the most from the least. The dose response, is going to differ for some people. I mean, you might have someone, who's, it could be like they take a 2.5 milligram pill, and they're a slow metabolizer, and that's all they need. They can tolerate that. That's it, right? That's all. That's great. Like you save a little bit of money. So you have to do 20, you do like 1/10 the dose. Yeah.
A lot of times people get hung up though, and they're like, "Oh, I need to work up. If I'm going to get the fat loss, I got to get up to that 10." And Hey, one more here from James. He had going back to DC, and I know the answer to this, but he said, can you still do DC if you're over 50 years old? So how about DC training for older guys?
No, it's forbidden. Actually, the universe
can't do it. Can't do it, James. Sorry, man.
Yeah, you'll try to go when you get to that first rest pause set, and you try to start, the weight just won't move. The universe will you'll just be paralyzed. Like, nope, straight sets for you, buddy. No rest pause. Go check out Dante. Anyone over 35, Dante has some suggestions. It's on the Intense Muscle website. He suggests people rep ranges be higher. Yeah, that's one big thing. But be progressive. This is how he does it too, and he's mentioned this innumerable times. He still tries to train progressively to the extent that's possible. Eventually, of course, unless your weight's going up and you're not going to keep getting stronger, in your 50s and 60s and 70s, right? Be bench pressing 800 pounds or anything like that. But higher rep ranges, and then that's when he suggests for people that have already sort of, they've gotten to where as good as they're going to be, they're in their 50s, so they're just trying to hold on. Then you can do that extended like 5-day split, 5-way split, which means 5 different training days. Yeah. So, but I still do, like when I did DC training, I still do the 2-way split. Yeah.
You change the rep range at all? Do you go to like higher reps? Yeah.
I do. It depends on the exercise. Yeah. And how it feels for me, but yeah, I still do the 2-way split, and I'm fine with it.
Nice. Yeah, one of the guys I work with, Ty, who watches the show, so I'm sure he's going to be seeing this. He was telling me he was, and he's like our age, and he was saying, yeah, I've been pushing really hard, and maybe low reps are like 5-6, and I was like, man, and he's not like an advanced lifter, and I said, gosh, man, let's back this off, and he's moved back now to like 15 for reps per set, and I just think that's such a better place to be, for especially for just as we age. And honestly, man, and we've talked about this too, it's, I think, harder to do higher reps. If I fail at 6, like at 5 or 6 reps, I just fail. If I get 5 and I can't get 6, I'm done. I try to get 6 and I'm like, oh, that's it. I'm done. Rack the weight. But if I can get 15, it's probably like really hard by 10, right? And then I get 11, and then I might need to take a breath, and then I get 12, and I'm like, oh my God, this is hurting so bad, and the weight's starting to move slower, and then 13 comes, 14, and then finally I'm like, okay, I think I can get one more. Then I get that 15, and maybe I have to really squeeze it out. I feel like, number one, the weight's lighter, right? So I'm less likely to hurt myself if I'm kind of still trying to focus on targeting that like the target muscle. I'm not just using like everything I have in my body to move the weight. Right. And I think I can get just an overall harder workout in say 15 reps than I can with 6. I don't care even if I was at my best, younger.
Yeah, you can grind more reps out, of course. The thing, especially if you've been training for a while, now you're pretty strong, right? You've been at it for 10, 15 years or whatever, so you're strong. So you're lifting weights, loads, I've mentioned this a million times, so you're lifting loads that are beyond what people who haven't been lifting for decades are lifting. So I have the sense when you're picking something up that, you can only lift 8 times, you're probably beyond the way we're doing, you're beyond what our musculoskeletal system evolved to handle on a regular repetitive basis.
Yeah.
Because we're, the reason why humans have this position in the world where we're sort of a virus spreading ourselves around and destroying nature. The reason why we're sort of at the pinnacle of other species, so to speak, is our brains. It's not our brawn, really.
Okay.
So, if you had to move something that was that heavy, you would come up with some sort of a leverage system. Right?
Yeah. Or you'd get a donkey to do it or something,
Right, exactly. Yeah, a donkey or whatever.
Yeah.
So, we didn't it's been so long since, as it was part of our evolution to pick things up like that. I mean, maybe when you're fighting, that would be it, when you'd have that level of effort.
Yeah.
But eventually, one of the things that happens is we have free radical damage that accumulates, and you have a change in the connective tissue. So when you're at that extreme loading range where you're doing sets of 5 and 6, I think you have, compared to when you're 20, you have an increased risk of damage to all the structures in the joints and the tendons, potentially the ligaments and everything like that. Yeah. So it's like, why do that necessarily? What's the purpose there? And it's funny because I was looking at the North Americans. I wanted to see because today's men's bodybuilding, so I wanted to see who's competing. Yeah. And but they, it might have been classic physique that was yesterday or something. Okay. I saw some older guys. It looked like it probably was the 60 plus.
Yeah.
And I looked at them and I'm like, yep, I get this, man, because those guys all looked like there was torn muscles somewhere. So there's sort of misshapen muscles. Right. And this is what I've noticed in my physique. It's just the years of heavy pounding. For me, heavy pounding. I was never world-class strong, but, decently strong has taken its toll.
Yeah. And
you get these little micro tears, these that accumulate, the muscles roll up, all this sort of thing. I talked about this on another podcast with Brandon and Cruz. We recovered an article I wrote for Elite FTS, called Rust Proofing the Iron Warrior.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I wrote a decade ago. So now there's the follow-up. And those little things add up over time and the muscles start to kind of roll up. So I wonder, if for the last 20 years, if I had not done sets of 5 or 6, not done some of the heavy, super heavy training for me, if some of these injuries wouldn't have sort of gradually accumulated. They're almost never have I had a tear where I'm like, oh, there I tore a muscle. A couple times in my calves, and those medial gastrocnemiae are gone. Okay. But anyway, those are the things back to the rep range thing is I think for someone who wants to keep doing it for the next 10 years, the chances of muscles being sort of damaged at a microscopic level, in a way that's not evident workout by workout, but over months and months and years is higher, just by virtue of being older. So maybe smart to stay away from the the super heavy stuff when you can still get a good growth effect by training the 10 to 15 or 15 to 20 rep range, which is what Dante suggests.
Yeah. I think that's smart.
Yeah, I think it is, but it makes sense physiologically just because the system isn't really made. It can withstand it, but the system really isn't made to handle these giant loads. And when you get older, it's just it takes a toll that's magnified, I think, compared to when you're younger.
And use 20 grams of collagen, hydrolyzed beef collagen from True Nutrition, and maybe some growth hormone on top of that. Just a couple units. Keep that connective tissue fresh and young.
Not from True Nutrition, though. They don't sell that there.
No.
Okay.
Man, I made this commercial. Then I had to only run it once because I said, guys, growth hormone's really expensive. So if you want to save some money, you should shop for your supplements at True Nutrition because then you'll be able to get on that pharma-grade growth sooner. And of course, that's I'm making a joke. And somebody, I was like, man, are people going to think that I'm saying you should get growth hormone from True Nutrition? So, Of course, somebody commented and they were like, hey, man, I went to the True Nutrition website and I didn't see those sponsors you were talking about. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
It's such a different world, man. Like it's just so everyone's so open about everything and just the thought because you can't order. I don't know what you get if you do that, but you can just Google and find places where you can place an order for that. Right?
Yeah, I'm sure you can. I wouldn't know.
Yeah. Oh man. Anyway, so no, it's none of that. It's True Nutrition, not True Pharmacopoeia or whatever.
Right. Let me see. I think we might have had one more in here if you had time for it, Scott.
Right.
So, what is this? It says, will the body's hydration affect the muscle patterns or the adrenals affecting the muscle activation patterns? This goes all the way back to that first conversation we had today.
With the adrenals, is that what he said?
Yeah.
There we go. Thanks.
Yeah.
So hydration, if you're dehydrated, for instance, you're going to have the potential for some spasticity. Right, so involuntary contractions, and that could potentially affect how things are being activated. Like one of the concerns of someone who goes into a workout poorly hydrated, who wakes up and is having muscle spasms or twitters or what have you. Maybe they're on something like clenbuterol, or
yes,
there are guys even who use diuretics,
continuously
to keep water off,
don't
that
do
kind
that.
of stuff.
Don't do that.
Yeah,
guys.
no, don't do that. But in a situation like that, then you're more prone for spasticity. There was a guy, I won't provide in the background, but someone I knew who used to get spasms in his sartorius. And like when I do my water protocol, just using no pharmaceutical diuretics, but pre-contest, when I would start to get any hints of cramping, I would typically get it in the sartorius of my legs. I would notice that when I get up out of bed. I'd notice when I lifted, my legs up and I bend at the knee to stand up, I'd get a sartorius cramp. So that was the first place to go. Anyway, he was getting those because he was that happened just where he'd get cramps because of whatever reasons. I don't know why he might have been dehydrated or not dehydrated, but in a situation where your hydration is causing a propensity towards cramping, you can have a muscle tear. And that's actually what happened to him, is he tore his sartorius because it cramped, I believe, while I was lifting, if I'm remembering correctly. So your hydration will affect the nerve activation. So your adrenals too. So adrenaline is involved with turning on glycogenolysis, for instance. Like I'm connecting some dots here. So how much glycogen you use. So like one thing, again, this isn't a suggestion, but one thing that I know from talking to guys who have been like high level cyclists is like on the Tour de France, if someone really needs to win a leg, like one thing they would need to do, or one thing they would do is they're near the end of their of that leg, and they would have a little a little syringe and needle with adrenaline in it, and they pull that thing out and jab themselves with adrenaline. And I know guys who've done this in the lab and watch what happens. So you'll get a massive stimulant effect from that, and a massive outpouring of glycogen, whatever you have left, right? And it has an ergogenic effect, right? Yeah. So of course that's then indirectly going to affect your activation pattern, because you're doing more work. Yeah. If you're someone who maybe has some hypoadrenal issues, so they don't have a normal sympathetic response to exercise, or just completely whacked out, burnout. Yeah. But they feel adrenal burnout or what have you. Maybe that is or isn't substantiated with any blood work. But they can't mount a normal sympathetic response to exercise. They're just not going to train as hard. They're going to have a hard time activating muscle as well. So they're not going to be able to do the same things they could. Yeah. There's a really kind of bizarre body of literature looking at an individual's ability to maximally activate skeletal muscle. They do this thing called twitch interpolation, where they superimpose an electrical stimulus either on the muscle or to the nerve, activating the muscle that's being tested. So usually it's like the femoral nerve, and they have someone like do a knee extension, and then they zap the muscle, and they look at the extent to which more force is added, and that will tell you if there's no extra added force, that would mean that you've got maximal motor unit activation. But that doesn't really work. It's not a very good method, because you have flow the opposite direction on that nerve. It goes back up, and you can actually see a decrease in force, which is what happened. We tried it in the lab, because you're impeding, you're sending a depolarization wave upstream, which counters the downstream depolarization wave coming from your brain, right? So if you get a decrease in force, like, what does that mean? It's because you blocked the descending pathways. And you can take people, there's studies where they suggest that older untrained people can maximally activate their quads, but then you take those people from that same population, they can increase quad strength by 80 or 100% in 2 months of training. It's like, well, how is that? How did they get so much stronger? Because they didn't double quad size. Yeah. So they meant they learned how to activate the muscle better. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. But if you can't maximally, if you're not able to, so I think most people can't maximally activate their muscle until you get to a very highly trained level, and then there are people who can do that. But if you don't have a normal adrenal response, you're not going to get normal use of fuel. So you're not going to have a normal force output. That's going to feed back and affect the motor unit activation. And you're just not going to feel like pushing as hard because you're tired. You're fatigued. You're going to have probably a central fatigue phenomenon. So you're going to just feel like crap. Yeah. Right. As opposed to like someone who's completely caffeine habituated, and they go and they train with their normal 5 cups of coffee, and then they try to go in the next day with no coffee. Yeah. Their training's going to suck, right? Yeah. So there's going to probably be a central fatigue mechanism involved there, because they're lacking the normal level of stimulants that they've become habituated or adapted to. So, yeah, so your adrenals will affect fuel supply and at least psychologically, nerve activation patterns coming from the brain. So yeah. I don't know if that answers his question, but yeah, those things both make a difference, I think.
All right. Right on. Well, listen, guys, we appreciate everybody hanging out with us and, leaving questions and everything. And leave us questions for the next episode. You guys have been awesome with putting together some really thoughtful ideas for Scott to talk about. And it's always a pleasure to listen to you share your thoughts, Scott.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it was a ramble day. I feel like I just rambled on, but, hopefully there was some value.
I think there was. I think there's some good stuff in there. And guys, we appreciate you tuning in. Use our code THINK over at TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK.
Now
it's my letter opener here at the desk. Yes.
Do people have letters in their throats that you have to open?
And I'm holding a folding knife, guys. I was pointing it at, for the audio listeners, I was pointing it at the camera. Use our code THINK. And check out supplementsource.ca for Canadians, of course. ThinkBYOBBcoach.com. You can get Scott's book there, and you can go to Amazon for the hardcover, or we'll put the link in too for the discounted hardcover from Scott. And guys, we appreciate it. For another episode of Muscle Minds, we will see you soon. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome. Hasta.